Good afternoon, History 2020. We have a special guest from the Italian American Museum today that is with us to discuss the Italian American experience in California, the larger American narrative, the successes and challenges of the Italian American community as they navigate really a post-Civil War landscape that is not always friendly as well. And so I am going to record this session for you guys to refer back to. If you want to look further into our images that she has put into our presentation, then we can have you reach out to the Italian American Museum. So I see my students putting their names in chat. I love that for participation. But let me go ahead and introduce Mariana Gatto, who is the director and creator of the Italian American Museum. She is also a Cal State LA alumni, majoring in history, earning her degrees in history and I think education. She is here today to really just share space and talk about the fabric of this nation that really, exemplifies the Italian American experience. So thank you, Mariana. We welcome you into our Zoom space, and I will turn over the session to you.
Well, thank you for having me. I speak at a number of colleges and universities, and it's definitely being an alum of Cal State LA, this is much more of a special experience. And I think we also mentioned that I'd love to hear your questions. If I'm not going to be paying attention to the chat, unfortunately, it's a little bit too much for me to do the presentation and talk and then look at the chat, but please, feel free to save your questions till the end. And I would be happy to take as many of them as possible. So we can get started. So when we think of Italian immigration to the United States, seldom is Los Angeles the city that comes to mind. What are some of the places that we think of? Obviously New York, and this image is of Mulberry Street in New York and at the turn of the century. Other cities like Boston or Chicago. But you would be probably surprised to know that not only is Los Angeles home to the nation's 5th largest Italian American population, but the Italian presence in Los Angeles spans nearly 200 years. It predates California's statehood by a quarter of a century. The first Italian settler arrived in Los Angeles in 1827, and to kind of put that date in perspective, that's about a little over 3 decades before the Civil War. So, whereas Italians began arriving in mass in places on the East Coast and the Midwest in the late 1800s, the settlement here started, quite earlier. Why did Italians come to Los Angeles? Well, it's not what you might think. Today the city is famous for, one of its, its largest exports, and I'm of course referring to the motion picture or the entertainment industry. But it was actually agriculture, viticulture or winemaking, fishing that drew Italian settlers to the region. And here you see an image of Italian vineyard workers in Pasadena around 1900. Long before Napa became the winemaking capital of the state, it was actually Los Angeles that was the center of winemaking. And this is an image of downtown-ish in the 1870s. This right here is Main Street, and this church that you see in the photograph, some of you might be familiar with it today. It's known as the Placita Church, or Our Lady Queen of Angels. It's the oldest existing Catholic church in Los Angeles. And this right here is actually Olvera Street. The Italian American Museum is located right around here, but this is kind of like the large plaza. Over here would be Union Station. So it was this area that winemaking was really concentrated in the early 1900s. And by the middle of the century, Los Angeles was producing about 60,000 gallons of wine annually. And leading up into the early 1900s, There were over 100 wineries located in Los Angeles proper, and many more in greater Los Angeles, in the little communities centered around Los Angeles, because as you probably know, Los Angeles was a lot smaller back in those days. It wasn't until the early 1900s that it began to annex places like San Pedro, which is now part of the city, and Highland Park and Lincoln Heights. So this area here around the plaza was one of LA's first and oldest Italian communities. It was in this area that you saw also, a number of other ethnic groups living, ethnic and cultural groups. I often liken the plaza to, kind of what Los Angeles is today, in that you had Italians, Mexican and Mexican Americans, Chinese Americans, African Americans, Japanese, Slavs, Jews, all kind of coming together around what was really kind of like the social, cultural, and the business hub, the economic hub of the city back in those years. So now, while many of Italian Americans on the East Coast were toiling in factories and sweatshops, which you probably learned about in your discussions on the Gilded Age, the Italians of Southern California were often farming. They were working outdoors, as many of them had in Italy. So the adjustment, what was required of them to become acclimated to life in the United States, arguably wasn't as great as maybe some of their contemporaries elsewhere in the nation. The Italians of Southern California, as well as their counterparts in places like San Francisco and the Central Valley, would help make California the agricultural giant that it is today. They introduced many crops to the region, including bell peppers, certain types of citrus, broccoli. We think of broccoli today as, this American staple. We see it on our plates and don't even, think about it much. But broccoli is an Italian word, and it was introduced by Italian immigrants. There was an Italian family in the Central Valley that would grow one of the first commercial crops of broccoli in the early 1900s, and then ship it across the country packed in ice, and really made, broccoli this word that, again, we don't really examine its roots. A lot of these companies today remain owned by the original Italian families who started them in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Some other examples are Progresso, which you probably know as like a manufacturer of canned soup. Progresso, interestingly enough, predates Campbell's as the first canned ready-to-eat soup in the United States. Del Monte was also founded by Italian immigrants up in the Bay Area. I can talk about food for quite a while, so I'll move on.
I can too. That's fine.
Now, as Southern California continued to grow and expand, it drew Italian immigrants and Italian Americans from other parts of the nation, including New York, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Colorado, and elsewhere. You'd be surprised to know, perhaps, that Los Angeles was home to, at one time, to 6 Italian enclaves, or Little Italy. And one of them was the North Broadway district, which is now Chinatown. You may or may not be aware that the city's original Chinatown was located where Union Station is now. And that community was displaced in order to construct Union Station. And there was a larger story around it than that. But just to kind of simplify, so as the new Chinatown was built, where many of you are familiar with it today in near downtown, and of course there are other Chinatowns in the San Gabriel Valley. But what was Little Italy kind of, was gradually broken up, and Italians began to disperse from, their Little Italy in the North Broadway district. You can still see remnants of this Little Italy if you drive along North Broadway. There is, of course, St. Peter's Italian Church in the Casa Italiana, where they still do big Italian feast days. Last weekend was the Feast of St. Joseph. They do still Mass in Italian on Sundays. And of course, there's a Columbus Pharmacy, kind of a throwback to the early 1900s. And if you keep on going a little further, there's also the San Antonio Winery, which we'll talk about, I think, in just a moment or so. So this is an image of the church I just mentioned, St. Peter's, in the early 1900s. This is what it looks like today. Interestingly enough, a little bit of LA trivia. If you're familiar with Cathedral High School, which is located just north of the church here, both Cathedral High School and St. Peter's were built on what was one of LA's earliest cemeteries. So the cemetery was decommissioned and they built the high school, and the church was actually constructed, the original church was constructed in what was one of the memorial chapels that was dedicated to one of LA's very wealthy one of LA's very wealthy residents. And so that's what you see here. But Cathedral High School, their team is called the Phantoms because the school was built on former cemetery land. And then when it was decommissioned, it moved further east. And now you still see Calvary Cemetery near, further out onto the east side, not far from the university. Another Little Italy, or two other Little Italies, I should say, were located in San Pedro, largely a fishing community south of downtown Los Angeles, where incidentally the West Coast tuna industry was born. And it was largely it was largely immigrant fishermen of many different countries, including Italy, Japan, Portugal, what is now Croatia, who were an integral part of the fishing industry. And their counterparts were often immigrant women who worked in the canneries and helped make it a multi-billion-dollar industry. Of course, many of these canneries have closed in recent or more recent years and relocated abroad. Another very kind of lost Italian community was located in what was called then the East Side, just southeast of downtown Los Angeles, where incidentally an Italian-American nun would establish one of the city's first public daycare facilities. And this woman was Mother Cabrini. She came to the United States as a young woman and worked all over the country. You can see places in Chicago and New York and Colorado dedicated in Mother Cabrini's honor, or they were institutions that were founded by her. And she became the first American citizen to be canonized saint. Just as we witnessed elsewhere in the nation, many of Los Angeles Italian enclaves were later redeveloped, or their character changed as other ethnic communities came to inhabit them. For instance, what was an Italian social club in Lincoln Heights, a neighborhood that was home to approximately 20,000 Italian Americans leading up to World War II, is now a Cambodian cultural center. What was a Little Italy in the East Side is now a freeway. Here you see Italian families celebrating the end of World War I in a neighborhood just north of downtown that was referred to then as Dogtown. This residence and basically the entire neighborhood was demolished. It is now the men's central jail. So it may or may not have come up in this class or other classes that oftentimes the communities that were targeted for demolition or redevelopment or were referred to as slums were the ones that were erased from the map many times because the residents were not always in the position to fight these projects. And let's see. The Los Angeles Italian American experience represents a fascinating chapter of the Italian diaspora, in part because of many of the ways in which it, technology, in part because of the many ways in which it differs from the Italian American experience that you're most familiar with. Italian Americans faced fewer obstacles in Los Angeles, in part because in the early days when Italians first began arriving in Southern California, Los Angeles was still part of Mexico. It was a city that was very much influenced by its Spanish and Mexican roots. And because there are more similarities, you could say, kind of cultural sensibilities shared between Italians and Mexicans, Italians were able to achieve upward mobility. They became successful. They faced fewer barriers in employment and in housing. When we talk about ethnic communities, Little Italies or fill in the blank, oftentimes they form out of necessity. You have a group of people who come here who don't speak the language, who are unfamiliar with American ways, and they kind of gather together in a particular neighborhood. There's often an economic component to that. You know, they do this because it's one of the areas that they can afford, but they often do it because they're not welcome elsewhere. And in Los Angeles, yes, you saw these neighborhoods form, Italian enclaves form, but there weren't as strict rules in Los Angeles as applied to Italians compared to other groups or compared to their contemporaries elsewhere in the nation. And I'll give you an example. In New Orleans in the late 1800s, 11 Italians were lynched after being tried and acquitted for the murder of a police captain. And this event really was an example of a lot of the anti-Italianism that was taking place at the time. Italians were not welcomed in those years as they started arriving in mass. Italians were the group that many people wanted to keep out of the United States. They were the immigrants who people didn't want around. They were considered purveyors of crime, and their ways were considered contrary to American ways. And so during those same years, we see an Italian American who's elected to the Los Angeles City Council. So two very different experiences. This is not to say that everything was smooth sailing here, that Italians did not face any prejudice. You may have discussed in your class that in various parts of Los Angeles, certain groups were barred from owning property. And how did this work? Well, if you tried to purchase a property in certain neighborhoods of Los Angeles and you belong to a certain group, African American, Latino, Jewish, Arab, and they referred to them in different terms during this time, two things would happen. Either the real estate agent would not sell you the property, would, basically say, thank you, but no thank you. But it was also written on the deeds to these properties in certain neighborhoods that the home or the other property could not be sold, owned, or occupied by a person who was not of the Caucasian race. And many of these deeds went on to specify who could not own these properties, who could not occupy these properties. Some of them went even further to say that, basically after dusk, after the sun went down, these properties could not be inhabited by people who were not of the Caucasian race. And during that time, depending on where you were, Italians were one of the groups who were often prohibited from owning property in parts of the city. There's interesting stories that we've recorded over the years. For instance, there was an Italian man who became very successful in the produce industry in Southern California. And while he had amassed great wealth and wanted to purchase a home in San Marino, this was one of the communities that was governed by these restrictive covenants. And so he was prohibited from buying a home there, and he ended up buying in not far from Cal State LA, actually. So, these are the things that we often don't talk about in local history, but I think by doing so, we gain a more complete understanding of our nation's history and certainly of local history. Another topic that I think is worth studying is the World War II Italian American experience. So when the nation entered the war, 600,000 Italian Americans who had not received their United States citizenship, who had not become US citizens, were deemed enemy aliens. Just as a little refresher, I'm sure you're all aware, but during World War II, the United States was at war with Italy, Germany, and Japan. And the Italian Americans of the West Coast, the so-called enemy aliens, were subject to a host of restrictions. Some of the most visible members of the community were arrested and sent to internment camps. Now, it is important to say that the treatment that Italian Americans experienced during World War II was not of the same severity as what Japanese and Japanese Americans experienced. Upwards of 200,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were, ripped from their homes and sent to internment camps. And this is, I think many consider it, I know I do, one of the worst violations of civil liberties in our nation's history. The numbers of Italian Americans considered enemy aliens was larger, 600,000, but the number that were sent to internment camps, the number who were interned, was a lot smaller. So we're talking about, a few thousand people compared to hundreds of thousands of people. There are a lot of ironies in this experience, though. So many Italian Americans were targeted for arrest and internment, not because of what they had done, but what they were deemed capable of doing. These were people like school teachers, journalists, who were considered capable of influencing people. So those were the people who were targeted for internment. Ironically, a lot of these people had fled fascism. They were not supporters of Mussolini. They were actually were people who spoke out against fascism, Mussolini. But we often see during wartime that nuances, facts are overlooked. They're forgotten. So there's another kind of irony. Is that Italian Americans were one of the largest groups serving in the United States military at that time. Upwards of 1.5 million Italian Americans served during World War II, and many of them would pay the ultimate price for their service. Yet their families, their parents, their grandparents were looked at with suspicion. So, for instance, one of the requirements of enemy aliens, again, enemy aliens were anybody who had not become an American citizen. were required to register as such. They had to report to their local post office and be photographed and fingerprinted and carry an enemy alien ID on them at all times whenever they left their homes. And many of these people who were, again, enemy aliens, like this woman, Frances Corsentino, had American-born children who were serving in the military. So we're going to backtrack a little bit now. In 1908, a building known as the Italian Hall was constructed at the Plaza, which again was one of the earliest Italian neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And the building was constructed to be a community center, a gathering place for Italian Americans of Los Angeles. And pictured here is the building in 1919. This was a banquet of Il Circolo Operaio Italiano, which was a group of Italian workers. They translate to the Italian Workers Club. And if you notice, everybody has their own bottle of wine. Anyway, so the venue became a popular place for weddings, for concerts, for political and social events. It hosted people of international significance, from a very famous Italian aviator by the name of Francesco Di Pinedo, feminist Emma Goldman, who I hope you have encountered in your studies, also spoke at the building. And the Mexican revolutionaries, Ricardo and Enrique Flores Magón, who were, exiled from Mexico because they were critical of the dictator of Mexico, Porfirio Diaz. They would come to Los Angeles and speak at Italian Hall, help raise awareness and funds for the revolution taking place in Mexico at that time. Interestingly enough, the brothers, they were arrested numerous times, but it was at the last event that they held at Italian Hall that the brothers were arrested for distributing seditious literature, or literature that was critical of the American government. And they were sent to prison, and one of the brothers would die in prison. So you see how this building, the Italian Hall, which was one of the few free speech venues in the progressive era Los Angeles. If you studied the progressive era, you're aware that throughout the country, this was a time of tremendous activism, when workers were advocating for a better deal for themselves, better wages, safer working conditions. This was the era that brought us things like the weekend, like the 8-hour day. And the leadership of Los Angeles at the time did not want the city to become like Chicago or New York, where there's what they considered, radical political activity taking place. And so they placed limits on where people could come together for things like marches and demonstrations. And the Plaza was one of the few free speech areas in the city. So as a result, we saw all these people come and speak at the Plaza and speak at Italian Hall. And so the building, therefore plays this role in a number of causes, of movements that had implications for people who were not simply, who were not just Italian American, and who were not only American, So it's in this respect such a fascinating place. On the ground floor of the building was an elegant saloon that was also operated by Italian immigrants. This is what the building looks like today, and where the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles is located. The building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and is one of the oldest remaining buildings from LA's historic Little Italy. Admission to the museum is free. It's always free. So we hope that you'll come visit us, bring your families, bring your friends. What is unique about the museum is that a fraction of our visitors are of Italian descent. Whenever we create, an exhibition or a program, we do it in mind. We do this with this in mind, knowing that we want something that appeals, that's relevant, that engages everyone. And we want, you to walk away with an understanding of, the significance of Italian Americans within the larger Los Angeles, within the larger mosaic of, our nation. And hopefully draw some, kind of feel a sense of, shared experiences, because there are many that are unique to Italians and Italian Americans. There are many that are unique to the group to which you identify, but there's a lot of shared experiences. And I think when we as Americans focus on our shared experiences, not only present, but throughout history, we realize that so much of what is often orchestrated to divide us really becomes a moot point. Alrighty, so this is a view of our permanent exhibition wing. And if you notice, there are large screens in the foreground of this image. These are made out of a special type of glass that transforms from transparent to opaque, and we project an overview of each of our 7 exhibitions onto these glass panels. This is kind of designed for the more casual visitor who might spend, 20 minutes or so looking at an overview of the permanent exhibition. This is kind of a view of an event. You'll also notice that there are screens attached to each exhibition case, and those screens contain the complete version of each exhibition. For those of you who want to kind of dig in deeper, one of our most popular exhibitions in terms of how long people spend with it is entitled Dago. Dago is an ethnic slur for Italians. And this exhibition examines anti-Italianism in the United States. Let's see. Here's another view of our permanent exhibition. This exhibition, our permanent exhibition, is also accessible in its entirety online. So if you are unable to visit the museum, or you want to spend more time with this content, if you'd like to use it as a research tool, you can visit our website, imla.org, and you'll see our entire permanent exhibition. And it's a great reference for maybe some of your classes. And our collection, our entire museum collection, is also searchable online. So here's some information about that. And, again, our visitors include everyone from the very young to high school students. And we hope that we'll see you in these photos as well. The process of creating the museum was not an easy one. I've been working on this project since 2005. There were a lot of roadblocks along the way. This is some images of what the building looked like over the years. Basically, after the Italian community stopped using it as a community center in the 1950s, the state of California purchased the building and many other historic buildings in the area to create El Pueblo State Historic Park. This was a time when many of LA's historic buildings were being demolished in the name of progress. And thankfully, the state of California had the foresight to purchase these buildings and preserve them. But they never really had the money to maintain them. And so a lot of them, including Italian Hall, began to languish and just fall into severe disrepair. This is what the building looked like when I first got involved. So this is kind of a then and now. After many years spent raising money, restoring the building, which is listed, as I mentioned, on the National Register of Historic Places, and all work that we do has to go through various, permitting processes. We reopened the museum in 2016. In addition to our permanent exhibition, we also present a number of temporary exhibitions, 2 each year. They explore a variety of topics. This one looked at the history of Sicily through the lens of the Sicilian cart, which is a decorative type of cart or horse-drawn wagon typical to the islands. We partnered with Dolce & Gabbana for this exhibition. We also do exhibitions that are more visual arts oriented, such as Italianità, which was an exploration of Italian American identity. Another one that we did in 2019 examined the work of Leo Politi, who's a great author and educator, really a pioneer in the multicultural movement in children's literature. Another on Italian Americans in animation. Right before the pandemic, we opened one that explores the tradition of St. Joseph's tables. We also look at, of course, what contemporary Italian Americans are, how they're contributing to our culture and society. Pictured here is the Russo brothers, who are the directors of the Captain America, Avengers, that Marvel franchise, and of course, the Captain America shield that was used in several of the films. We offer a variety of curricula and resources for educators. We do events for a variety of ages. Also a upscale food and wine tasting called Taste of Italy, a golf tournament. During the pandemic, we shut our doors, our physical doors closed, but our virtual doors opened wider. We had a very large presence online prior to the pandemic, but then we also started really increasing our virtual programming, everything from lectures, webinars, concerts, book presentations. We did a series of kind of cultural educational videos that incorporated one of Italy's most famous exports, its food. Interestingly enough, Italian food is the most popular ethnic cuisine in the nation. And we could do an entire other presentation on how deeply integrated Italian cuisine is in our diets. Again, we were talking about broccoli earlier, but nowadays when we talk about, oh, let's go have some American food, we say, oh, pizza and hamburgers. Interestingly enough, neither are American, but we've really come to think of it as such. And that is the conclusion of my presentation. I'd love to hear from you and any questions that you might have.
This was excellent presentation. So students, right now we have a couple more minutes before we end our classroom session. And so please ask Mariana any questions, put them in chat. I can read them to her, or just unmute yourself and ask. We have for about 20 more minutes. That was a fantastic presentation. I love that.
Thank you.
Anytime you want to talk about food.
Okay.
I am there and everything. Well, Whitney has a series of questions that she put into chat. And Whitney, we can talk about this after the spring break too, but she said she was shocked that there were restrictions on Italian Americans. We don't think of that as something that is part of the historical narrative either when we talk about race and ethnicity. But she asked, was the other brother in the Flores Majon brother ever released, or did they both die in prison?
No, only I believe Enrique, and I double check on this, but I believe Enrique died at Leavenworth
Yes,
Federal Penitentiary,
yeah.
and Ricardo, you know, he lived out his life, you know, as a free man at a certain point.
Okay, thank you for those updates. She also asked, is there any exhibition that she would definitely recommend? I gave this option for them to visit the museum as an extra credit. So is there any exhibition that you think is
Well, yes. So right
Yeah,
now, our current temporary exhibition, and I should have included this in the presentation, but our current temporary exhibition is probably our most popular ever, and it examines Pinocchio. And I know that sounds rather juvenile, but Pinocchio, interestingly enough, many of you may not be aware, was written by an Italian author in the late 1800s. And of course, it was adapted most famously by Disney. But Pinocchio has been translated into more languages than any other book besides the Bible. And this exhibition asks, why? What is, you know, our continued love, obsession with Pinocchio? You know, you see him reinvented by cultures, reinterpreted by cultures around the world. And so as part of this exhibition, we're exhibiting one of the only remaining first edition copies of Pinocchio that remains in the world. There's all kinds of great toys. It's a lot of fun. And whether, you know, you're young, somewhere in between, young at heart, it's a great exhibition to visit. And, you know, I often tell people, make a day of it, take the train, we're right across from Union Station, visit the museum, go have lunch, or, you know, see some of the other museums in the neighborhood. So I definitely recommend that. And then also, like, if you do have an extra moment, you want to visit us, or again, you can access it on our website. Many people find the exhibition called Dago on anti-Italianism really enlightening, and it's I think it kind of contributes a lot to our understanding about race and ethnicity in the United States, and, you know, kind of the fluidity of the situational race nature of race and ethnicity in the United States.
I think that's important, Mariana. And when we studied the Gilded Age, we talked about the shiftness of whiteness and again, the discrimination and those stereotypes that all Italians were this way too. And we had mentioned it, and that was mentioned in the course textbook. Margarita also mentioned that Pinocchio just won an Oscar.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So it was,
yeah,
it's kind of, the timing was very serendipitous to kind of give you an
yes,
idea of like the backside of the museums. We had originally intended to open this exhibition in June of 2020, but the
okay,
world had other plans, the universe
yes.
had other plans. So we pushed it. And, you know, the timing couldn't be better with the new films. And of course, you know, winning the Oscar. So there's been a lot more attention to this exhibition and our museum as a whole than ordinarily I think there would have been had we done it earlier or at a different time.
I grew up with Pinocchio. I grew up with all that, and I love it and everything. And I can't wait to see the movie. I'm scared to go in the pandemic, but I think it's important though. And again, the fact that we don't see Italian Americans enough in our course textbooks, I think was one of the reasons why I wanted you to share this, you know, in a history survey course. Do you guys have any more questions for Mariana? Please put them in chat for me. You know, let me know. And then maybe we can plan a visit and everything, which would be very cool, I think, too. Let me see what they said. Oh, Margarita, it was impressive then. Okay, it was good. That's what I wanted to do. Let me stop, and I'll stop the recording right now and everything, as we're kind of